Welcome to the Extra Mile podcast for bar exam takers. There are no traffic jams along the Extra Mile when you're studying for your bar exam. And now, your host, Jackson Mummy, owner of the Celebration Bar Review.
Well, hey, everybody. Welcome to episode 268 of the Extra Mile podcast for bar exam takers. This is your host, Jackson Mummy. I'm glad to be with you as always. We are in the middle of what we think of as this sort of lull period in August between the July exams and the beginning of results season. And typically this would be a pretty slow time when it comes to bar review and bar exams. But of course, there's all the controversy that led up to and included the July 2019 exams, and that continues relatively unabated at this point. And then we have a new piece of the puzzle, which is something called the Testing Task Force, set up by the National Conference of Bar Examiners, the people that create the multi-state bar exam and the multi-state essay test and the multi-state performance test and the multi-state professional responsibility exam. And the Testing Task Force is an ongoing survey that the NCBE has commissioned to look at the future and the choices ahead in the bar exam. And in today's episode, we're going to take a deeper dive into the first initial report from the Testing Task Force and the reaction to it. So stick around, it's important stuff, and I think it helps give us all a sense of where the test might be going and frankly where it may not be going over the next few years. So we hope you'll stick around for that. If this is your first time with us on the podcast, we're glad that you found us, and want to let you know that we prepare these podcast episodes in two formats, video and audio. If you prefer to watch the video, you can do that by going to celebrationbarreview.com/268. That's the episode number 268. If you prefer to listen to your podcast, you can do that on Apple Podcasts, on iHeartRadio, on Spotify, on radio.com, and lots of other places where podcasts are syndicated. And there's complete show notes no matter which version you use. We also have our entire archive of podcast episodes on our website. Just click on the tab for case studies and you'll see a link to podcasts. And before we jump into today's discussion and message, I want to remind you that, as always, our podcast is brought to you by our all-new free webinar training. It's called Do Something Different, Make the Next Bar Exam Your Last Bar Exam. This is a detailed look at the 4 steps that successful bar takers follow in order to pass their exams. We'll take you step by step through the program using case studies and the words of successful examiners or successful bar takers. I don't think the examiners joined me for this one, but successful bar takers talking in their own words in video about what they did to be successful. Now, this training is absolutely life-changing if you're taking the bar exam, and it's completely free, but you do need to register. And you can do that by clicking on the button in the show notes for today's podcast or by going to celebrationbarreview.com/webinar. Once you register for the webinar, you can choose to watch at the day and time of your preference so that you can make it as convenient as possible. Now, I can tell you, we've been doing some version of this webinar for years and years. We've just recently updated it to add all new content, all new case studies. I really am excited about it. I think it's the best that it's ever been. And literally thousands of people have used this material successfully. So I encourage you to check it out. It's completely free. You can watch at your own convenience. All you have to do is go to that website, celebrationbarreview.com/webinar, or click on the button here on the podcast to reserve your seat. And we'll see you on the webinar. Well, with that, I don't want to wait any longer. I want to jump into our discussion today about the Testing Task Force and the choices in the bar exam. Well, it's certainly an interesting time in the apex and development and creation of this thing we call the bar exam. You know, the bar exam actually started back in the 1970s as we currently know it in some form with the multi-state bar exam, but bar exams have been given in the United States for more than 100 years. And it's probably time to reimagine it and think about it a little differently. Some people are calling this discussion the future of the bar exam. I'm going to actually refer to an article that was recently listed or printed in Above the Law, a blog by Kyle McEntee with that title. It's a great article. I disagree with a lot of Kyle's conclusions, but I think it's a really good summary of what's going on. But at the same time, while we think about the future of the bar exam, I've actually got a graphic up behind me of a series of doors. because I think there are a whole lot of choices for us with the bar exam today. And behind some of those doors, there are some good choices. Behind some other doors, I think not so good choices. Kind of reminds me of Let's Make a Deal. And in this particular discussion, what I want to do is take a look at the first phase of the report of the NCBE, the National Conference of Bar Examiners, their testing task force. And this is the report of the testing task force itself. They're actually doing 3 phases of this study. Phase 1 is this report that summarizes what people in the legal profession think about current licensing processes and the exam itself. And then phase 2 of this process will be a discussion and a survey of people currently in practice as to what services and skills they think new lawyers need. And then phase 3 will be a report to the population, to the group, of what the recommendations are for the bar exam going forward. It's an interesting process, and I give the National Conference credit for taking on this task. I think finally they have heard from enough places and enough people that there are significant problems in the bar exam. In fact, the testing task force on their own blog, and we will link to this in our show notes, asked the question, is it time for a bar exam revolution? The examiners say, and I quote here, "The bar exam, when it's done right, is one of the best tools the profession has to make sure everyone who has the necessary skills and knowledge, and no one who doesn't, gets the opportunity to be a lawyer." Well, it's easier said than done, isn't it? And the question really is how to construct tests that appropriately assess what the examiners describe as the variety and complexity that's the practice of the law in a rapidly changing world. How do we make the bar exam, they ask, relevant to all potential lawyers, depending on or regardless of what area of practice they're going to take? And then the examiners, or the testing task force, says the question isn't just what new lawyers need to know, it's also which of those things should be tested on a licensure exam. And so they've embarked on this process to begin to ask what should be on the bar exam. Now, obviously, if you're taking a bar exam in the next year or two, this is going to have little or no impact on you. But in the long run, it could be substantial, and it could be really a game changer if the bar examiners follow through on what they discover. Here are some of the questions that the testing task force are asking themselves, and I think it's helpful to have this as a prelude before we get into the results of phase 1. But the task force says, for example, could legal research tasks or simulated client interviews be incorporated into the bar exam without increasing the cost of the test? Could the bar exam reflect technology's growing role in the delivery of legal services? Is it practical to do it? What could experiential learning portfolios do as compiled by law students during their schooling? Could that be part of the licensure process? Could bar associations or legal employers use information from the practice analysis survey to create new post-licensure training or mentoring programs? So you can see that it's a broad range of questions that are being asked. And again, I think it's very heartening that the examiners are at least asking those questions. Now, let me tell you where I differ from some of the commentary that's going out right now, and this particular article that we're going to link to by Mr. McEntee. What some commentators are saying right now is, let's give the NCBE a ton of credit because they're willing to say publicly some not so kind things about themselves. Okay, great. Congratulations, NCBE. You're willing to say what all of us know anyway, and what people have been saying for years and years now. And I'm not sure how much credit we need to give the bar examiners for simply acknowledging the obvious. And so I would put myself in the skeptic camp. I think just because they're willing to say that these criticisms of the existing test are out there, it doesn't in any way, in my mind, indicate that they're actually going to make those changes. I think that there are institutional structural barriers to making the kinds of changes that I just talked about, or that the testing task force asked about, that probably are much deeper and broader and very unlikely for change of a substantive nature and a substantial nature to actually occur. I mean, it would be nice if we used technology, but remember, we're still talking about an organization in the NCBE that's devoted millions of dollars to developing a paper and pencil Scantron multiple choice test. it seems unlikely to me that they're going to walk away from all of that in favor of doing more, realistic real-world practice testing. And I think it's important to recognize that. And so let's not go too far. Let's not go overboard with giving props to the NCBE for their testing task force, simply because they went out to ask questions that I think many of us knew the answers to already. Now, let me just get to some of the phase one reports and what's been discussed as what I would call common threads or common themes that are running through the sessions. And in a minute, I'll tell you who was in phase one, who they tested or surveyed, but I want to point out just initially that phase one was a survey really of legal educators. It was a survey of people in the profession, although not any bar reviews. It was a survey of bar examiners and law school deans and law school members. So that was the first group that they surveyed, about 400 individuals. Now, here are the high-level takeaways from the report. They learned in this survey that the bar exam tests too much and too little. It should emphasize more lawyering skills, that's what the survey participants said, and less of the subject matter knowledge. Now, we've been saying that for a long time, and we've actually been saying, in truth, the examiners really have moved that direction anyway. The ability to memorize and recite rules is really not important. The survey suggests very clearly that that's what those in the profession already know, and the test has been gradually moving that direction. Another high-level takeaway was that the exam should utilize a lot more writing and do less multiple choice, and there should be other methods of evaluation. Sure, things like the performance tests certainly have grown in importance. I think we would see more of that going forward. How much less multiple choice? It's hard to say. There's a lot invested in the MBE, and it would be difficult for me to see them moving away from it. Another high-level takeaway is that jurisdictions should consider breaking the exam into different parts given over a longer period of time. Well, that's good and bad. I mean, I'm not sure a lot of bar takers want to devote a week or 2 weeks or coming back multiple times over a period of months to take the test. I'm not so sure that that's a great idea, but it's one that's being floated. I think that another of the comments is that that they printed, and this is where they got some credit, and I'm quoting here, the MBE, that's the multi-state bar exam, tests arcane, obscure, or trivial aspects of the law that new practitioners should not be expected to know and are not reflective of minimum competence. It tests too deeply on subjects. Memorizing black letter law for the MBE does not mimic real practice. Lawyers can look up the law and not rely only on memory in representing clients. I'll just stop for a minute. Does that sound familiar? Those of you that have been following the podcast and my work know that I've been saying that for more than a decade. There's too much focus on memorization. Yep. The MBE tests memorization and no skills. The MBE questions are full of red herrings and intentionally tricky. Now, that's not what the bar examiners are saying about it. That's what people in legal education are saying about it. Another comment was that multiple choice questions are not realistic or effective way to test what lawyers are doing. Yeah, I agree, absolutely. So the National Conference, went out and said, okay, we're going to print these things that say that our exam is not wonderful, and it's a group of dissatisfied stakeholders. Okay, so what else did they think should be done? Well, that's where we get a little deeper into the report itself and to phase one. But I wanted to point out that that's what they're getting a lot of credit for, is that they acknowledge something that I think everyone in the industry already recognizes, and that is the multi-state in particular is a ridiculous test, and it tests very little that's actually useful. I would make the one distinction, however, that while those people who were surveyed said it's a test of memorization, our experience has been you don't have to memorize to be successful on the test. And I think that's important, but it indicates the depth of the brainwashing that's gone on about this test. So what about this phase one report? Well, the first thing I think you have to understand is who the participants were in phase one. As I said, it was roughly 400 participants that attended sessions of workshops, and they were done in Zoom sessions online. It included bar administrators, bar examiners, law school deans, and their faculty, lawyer members of the ABA. And so it's groups like the Council of Bar Admissions Administrators, the Association of American Law Schools annual meeting, the NCBE Legal Educators Conference, the NCBE Annual Bar Admissions Conference, the Association of Academic Support Educators Conference, and so on and so on, the ABA Dean's Workshop. So they estimate about 400 people participated in the survey. I just want to point out that there were no actual bar takers in the survey. There were no bar exam providers in the survey. So it's that particular audience that they were talking to. Now, the questions that they asked the participants, I think, are helpful to understand. So I want to just list a couple of the key ones that they used in these sessions. One question was, what aspects of the current bar exam and MPRE do you think should be kept and why? Another was, what aspects of the current bar and the MPRE do you think should be dropped or modified and why? And then, what do you think the next generation of the bar exam should be in the test itself? So that's the basics of the questions. It was pretty open-ended. What do you like? What should go away? What should change? The key points, according to the report, the executive summary of phase one, and again, we'll list to this in the show notes, is that they point out, first of all, that the sessions that they did were intended to identify possible options, and they emphasize possible, not going to happen necessarily, possible options for redesign and gathering input on where greater emphasis should be placed. So there's no commitment here. There's no agreement. There's no sense of we know that we have to do it. They, in fact, point out that very few, if any, opinions were universally shared. Some of the opinions were obviously in conflict with one another. Most sessions, they point out, there were comments that supported various aspects of the model. That's not surprising either. So in terms of the takeaways from phase one, the first that the examiners point out, and this is interesting to me, I mean, for all the credit they get for talking about the bad things, they start with their strength. The MPT is the current strength of the bar exam. Okay, the performance test is something that people really like, and it's good and practical. I think we're going to see more MPTs. The next is that the MBE, the multi-state bar exam, simply tests things that are not necessary and goes too deeply within content. While the subject areas are applicable to newly licensed lawyers, the target level for items goes beyond the point of entry level competence. It goes into nuanced problems and exceptions to rules. That's one of the feedbacks that they got. Another feedback was that lawyering skills should be emphasized over subject matter knowledge. When you get to critical thinking, legal analysis, written and oral communication, reasoning, those are more applicable, according to the survey participants, for newly licensed lawyers. Content that focuses on subject matter knowledge that required memorization of legal rules is not considered as necessary because it can be looked up in practice, and that's absolutely the case. Another point was to consider adding legal research skills, providing an electronic database of legal resources. Another comment that came up at a high level was that too many subjects are covered on the bar exam. When you put the multi-state and the multi-state essay exam, the MEE, in combination, and certainly that's true in some states that don't use the MEE. So if you're not in a uniform bar exam administration state, so if you're in California or Georgia or Florida, for example, you've got an additional set of subjects that are state specific, and that's overwhelming. So those are some items with respect to content about the exam. Certainly some dissatisfaction with the multi-state bar exam, some dissatisfaction with the overall breadth of the exam, and some good feedback about performance tests. What about comments related to the format of the exam? Well, this was interesting. There was feedback that was given that constructed response items are preferred over multiple choice. We know this in assessment, and I've talked about this in many places, but authentic assessment rarely happens in a multiple choice item. And so the constructed response format of the multi-state essay exam and the multi-state performance test is more representative of what newly licensed lawyers do in practice than the multiple choice format of the MBE. So essays and performance tests are more authentic. Many of the stakeholders that were surveyed in phase one, however, recognize the benefits that the multi-state bar exam contributes. Its objective scoring, the reliability of the scoring, the scaled scores that provide consistency over time are all valuable. And I don't want to lose sight of that, because that's not what you're reading in the rights of the report. But the examiners have put that in there as well. They're going to hold tight, I think, to the multi-state bar exam. So don't get too excited yet. I don't think the MBE is going away. Another comment they got was to consider adding formats such as multimedia videos, using mock clients or simulations to provide a more realistic assessment. Again, I think there are just tons of practical concerns and problems here. I think that the downside in terms of much greater subjectivity in grading, potential for bias, which I think is huge, increased costs, those are all problems. Could it happen? Yes. Would it happen? I don't think so. The next broad area of discussion had to do with timing of the exam. So we had content and format. The third is timing. And here the primary takeaway was to consider a step testing approach for the bar exam. What this would mean, for example, is that the MBE might be the first step, and it said it could be completed while candidates are still in law school. I don't know what that means to the people that are out and coming back into the profession. But again, this is the bias of that particular group of people being surveyed. Then the second step of testing legal skills after graduation would be an enhanced MPT or essay exam in which legal resources are provided. You know, the survey participants also mentioned that there are some downsides to this step testing approach. It would take time away from summer employment opportunities or semester coursework. I mean, take another exam or another course in law school that you pay for that's really a bar exam course. There would be associated costs for hotel, travel, and prep courses to prepare for each of these pieces. And you'd still have people having to take multiple attempts at it. Additional administrations of the bar exam could let applicants take the test when they're ready. So instead of having it given just twice a year, maybe it should be given 3 or 4 times a year. I think that's a great idea. Reducing the time it takes to grade the essays and performance tests. Yeah, I've talked about that several places. I think in jurisdictions like California and Georgia that don't release results for more than 2.5 months after the exam, it puts their repeat bar takers at a huge disadvantage. And it was also acknowledged that more frequent administrations of the exam would require more staff and resources, thereby raising costs. So, of course, if an individual state's bar examiners were strapped for cash, as many of them are, it seems unlikely that this would be done. And frankly, I don't see more frequent administrations of the exam coming along anytime in the near future. Another broad topic was delivery and administration, and here the examiners and the testing task force said we got mixed feedback on how the exam should be administered and delivered. There's some support for paper-based testing, some for computer-based testing. Some people wanted to do both, and it should align with law school training and practice environments. Yeah, good luck. You know, I think we've already discovered, as we tried to just get people to use laptops on writing their essays, what a challenge that is. It is hard to imagine us moving to a computer-based test all the way through. Could happen, but I think it's unlikely. And then some broad level, just sort of general comments that were made from the survey. There's a support for increased uniformity and score portability of the uniform bar exam. I think this is absolutely true. People like the UBE. The fact that you can transfer the scores from one jurisdiction to another is a very popular feature. I would expect to see more of that coming in the future. It's a relatively easy change to make, and I think we're going to see more of it. There was also a discussion of a common passing score across jurisdictions. Now that's supported, but not universally. Gee, I wonder who wasn't interested in that. Can you say California, Florida, Georgia? You know, there are states that absolutely aren't going to do that and don't want any part of it. And I'm pretty sure they were the ones that said, we need to keep our own autonomy so that we can set our own passing score. And even within the UBE, there's no universal passing score. I mean, the numbers go pretty wide range from top to bottom. So I don't think you're likely to see that. Remember, bar examiners are wholly autonomous within their own state. And it seems unlikely to me that they're going to suddenly come together and sing Kumbaya around a single test and a single score. Another item that came up was something called conjunctive passing score decision rules. That sounds complicated, but essentially this means you have separate passing scores for different components, and then you allow the exam to be administered as a standalone. Parts of the test are done in these different modules, and then they are put together for an ultimate pass-fail decision. This would be similar to what CPAs do or physicians do with their medical licensure exam. Certainly could be done. It's just changes the entire structure and focus and how you prepare and what you put into those different components, but it's certainly a possibility. Another comment, and I'm glad this one made it somewhere onto the list, was to evaluate the impact of change on historically underrepresented populations of examinees. In other words, making sure that the exam is free from racial, ethnic, and gender bias needs to be a priority. I'm glad that the testing task force acknowledged that. I think there are some parts of these proposals or suggestions that have enormous capacity for bias. The performance tests certainly lead to that, but even the essay questions and how they're phrased and how they're graded leads to a potential for bias. So I think it's something to be very much aware of. And I think if you make the bar exam more expensive and you take more time to complete it, if you put it into more pieces, you require more travel, you are certainly challenging those with limited economic resources from being successful. So I think this is a primary consideration. I don't know how much importance it's going to ultimately have, but I think we want to keep that, in my view, at least front and center. And then considering the development of a diagnostic or a readiness test for delivery earlier in law school. Well, those of you in California already know what this is called. It's the baby bar exam. This is the test that you take in California if you go to an unaccredited or a state-accredited law school. And you have to take it after your first year of law school and pass it in order to get credit for those hours and to move on to ultimately complete law school and take the general bar exam. So there was a proposal and a discussion that the baby bar should be added across the country. That's just staggering to me. The goal here is to keep people from spending more money in law schools when they have no chance of passing the bar exam. And it's one of those interesting things where it seems like they're doing you a favor, but in reality, they're not doing you any favors at all. We've been teaching the California Baby Bar for 30 years, and I can tell you, it doesn't help people. It's another test. It's another set of expenses. It's more time out. It's more focus of their law school experience to just pass that one test. Frankly, they'd be better off taking those money and resources and time and energy and just putting them into a traditional law school curriculum and going on and taking the California General Bar. So I am not a fan of that suggestion at all, even though it would create certainly lots more business for us. But I think it's a really bad idea, and I would be very surprised if that gains much traction. Another comment was that the NCBE should offer more study aids as a supplement to commercial bar prep programs. Okay. You know, if that's all it took to pass the bar, great, have at it. I mean, I got to tell you that I've been doing this for too long with too many people to believe that. I know it sounds good. We're going to give you some really low-cost stuff, and you can practice questions and figure it out. You know, if that were true, we really don't need law schools either. I mean, why not just give people the books and let them read them for themselves? There is a skill set to this, and there's a way that I think needs to be done. And I think it's really just putting a very small Band-Aid on a very large wound to say that there should simply be more study aids available. I don't think that solves the problem. And then finally, the NCBE should share more detailed score information so people can better prepare. I agree, but here's the kicker. They wanted the detailed score information to go to law schools, not to the applicants, not to the bar review providers, not to the community at large. You know, if you don't give the applicant the information, what good does it do? And giving it to the law schools is crazy in my mind. I think it tells you the bias of the people that they were surveying and why they thought that was important. Frankly, we've got states like Georgia that give no information at all. We have some states that give fairly detailed information and everything in between. And I would just like to see some uniformity in that across all 50 jurisdictions. So that's the overview of everything that was in the Phase 1 survey. The results from Phase 1 are going to be used in part of Phase 3 on the design of what they call the next generation of the bar exam. Right now, we're in Phase 2 of the study, and this is a nationwide practice analysis asking about the importance and frequency of tasks performed by newly licensed lawyers. Now, we're going to put a link in today's message to that survey. And if you're watching this shortly after release and you're a practicing attorney, you're welcome to jump in and fill out that survey. If you're not a practicing attorney, go ahead and jump on the link anyway and just see what questions they're asking. It's fascinating. This will be phase 2 is trying to collect this set of information. Now, you notice that they're not asking people who are actually taking the bar exam for their opinions. They're not asking for bar review providers to ask our opinions. They're not asking for the community to provide their opinions. This is really about law school education and attorneys in practice. And that's all that they really want to know. And so I think there are going to be gaps because of that. I, again, would tell you that I'm a skeptic that this process will ultimately create much change that's substantial. It may move us a little bit on the margins. There may be a few changes that we see over time, but I would be very surprised if they're significant. We will, of course, keep you informed as this process goes on. It's designed to take the next year or so, and the report should be released in 2021. So it should be interesting to see what happens with all of that. I invite your comments and questions, as always. I hope that this is at least interesting for you to see what the bar examiners are thinking about and talking about. You'll see and read a great deal about this over the next year as they do more work and as these reports get out, but we wanted to make you aware of it right now. Well, that's our message for today. I hope that this discussion of the testing task force hasn't gotten your head spinning. I want to just reaffirm that nothing has changed right now. Nothing will change. If you're taking your bar exam in 2020, 2021, nothing on the horizon that's changing there. Test will be as it has been described. These are long-range choices to be made down the road. Now, I do want to remind you, if you're taking your bar exam in 2020 or 2021, we've got a free training webinar coming up for you. It's called Do Something Different, Make the Next Bar Exam Your Last Bar Exam. It's absolutely free, and you can watch at the time and day of your choice. All you have to do is register, and the link to register is at celebrationbarreview.com/webinar, or you can just click on the button here on the show notes. All right, well, that's it for this week. Have a great week. We will be back to you next weekend and talking as we start to get close to the very first set of results being released from the July exams. Hope everybody has a good study week and a good week, and we'll see you along the extra mile.
Thanks for listening to the Extra Mile podcast for bar exam takers at www.celebrationbarreview.com.